Welcome to Crossroads. An illegal immigrant was allegedly accidentally deported to El Salvador. And now a very different story is coming out from the White House. During a meeting between President Donald Trump, the El Salvador President Nayib Bukele, they clarified and revealed what they say actually happened with this deportation. And meanwhile, the tariff war is still ongoing, but only with China, which remains the last major holdout of the trade negotiations with Trump. And look, even Canada has come to the table. And also there's now talks of China trying to dump products onto the global market. And also in other news, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, he's facing an antitrust trial alongside congressional investigations. And this could see the company get broken up and maybe other things. I'll be deep diving into these topics and more today. Let's get started. Now, first off, folks, the Trump administration has fallen into yet another scandal. It's your weekly scandal. This one has been around allegations that they accidentally deported a father to a prison in El Salvador. Sounds terrible, right? Now, various news outlets have alleged that the man is innocent, that he was wrongfully accused of being a gang member. And it gets worse. There are allegations that the Trump administration is ignoring court orders to bring the man back to the United States, who they say was, wrongfully accused. And now look, they say an innocent man separated from his family is living in kind of a hellish environment in a prison in another country. But it turns out there's a whole other side to this story that's not being told. The man had been arrested multiple times before, allegedly taken in. There's more details coming out on it. And it's alleged as well that in court, he was in fact shown twice to have been a member of the gang MS-13. The Trump administration even alleges that news outlets misrepresented the facts on the court order. Now, look, first, this is going with the main narrative. The Daily Beast, this is what they say. They say the Trump administration admitted it accidentally deported a Maryland father with protected status to a notorious El Salvador mega prison, but officials are refusing to bring him home. And the government claims the courts can't make them. It notes the individual Kilmar Abrego Garcia was one of 250 men deported to El Salvador's Secot Terrorism Center after President Donald Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. And it said despite a judge's order halting deportations, they said bring those gang members back. The administration, it says, sent 2 plane loads of Venezuelans and a separate group of El Salvadorians on March 15th. Now, that sounds terrible, right? Now, they're going to note that he came to the United States when he was 16 years old. He married a U.S. citizen. He has a son who's 5 years old who's disabled. The Daily Beast also alleges, based on a complaint from his family, that he does not have a criminal record. Now, keep in mind, that's according to his family. And it also notes a court document that says Garcia was deported through an administrative error. Now, a lot of debate around the story started with a March 31st report from The Atlantic. And here's how that all went down. The article from The Atlantic spurred an online debate, which made it sound like the Trump administration was sending an innocent person to a prison in another country. And Vice President J.D. Vance, well, guess what? He responded to that claim. And here's what he said on April 1st. J.D. Vance said, "My comment is that according to the court document you apparently didn't read, he was a convicted MS-13 gang member with no legal right to be here." And he said, "My further comment is that it's gross to get fired up about gang members getting deported while ignoring citizens they victimize." So, in other words, well, the basis of the whole accusation that he was deported by air and that he was not a member of MS-13 was allegedly just caused by a journalist failing to actually read a document. But regardless, the case went through the court system and it caused a lot of sharp debates. It was used as a rallying call against the deportation policies of the Trump administration. And now, well, a very different story was just shown to the public yet again. Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador himself, traveled to the United States and he held a press conference at the White House yesterday. This was alongside President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and also other key figures in the Trump administration. Now, as you'd imagine, one of the journalists brought up the question about the case. And here's Attorney General Pam Bondi discussing the actual details of the case. Watch.
First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
So look, as she clarified, the man was determined by two courts to have been a member of the MS-13 gang, which has now been designated a terrorist organization. And if a court says America has to bring that man back to the United States, well, here's where it gets interesting. That would require El Salvador to send the man back, and he's an El Salvador citizen. So they would have to send one of their own citizens back to the United States on an order from a U.S. court. And the other problem with it is now, again, he's part of MS-13. They've now been designated a terrorist organization, which would mean they cannot send him here, which means that El Salvador, if they were to do this, would also be sending a terrorist smuggling into the United States, which would also violate the law. So it's a little complicated, right? Well, the timing was right with all this, since the president of El Salvador was sitting right there as well, so he could actually comment on it. Here's what Bukele had to say about the case during the bilateral meeting at the White House yesterday, with some follow-up points from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Watch.
Yeah, but we're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. We just turned the murder capital of the world to the safest country in the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? And that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into our country.
I mean, there's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people. Marco, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen outlined it. I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin. Except for Venezuela, that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President. No, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
So no refunds, right? The decision to return him would be up to El Salvador. The president of the country says it's not going to happen. And also on top of that, there were allegations that some news outlets may have even misrepresented the court order that's at the heart of the entire argument, suggesting the man should be returned to the United States. White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy Stephen Miller, he gave more details on that in that same White House meeting. Watch.
There's an illegal alien from El Salvador. So, with respect to you, he's a citizen of El Salvador. So, it's very arrogant even for American media to suggest that we would even tell El Salvador how to handle their own citizens as a starting point. As two immigration courts found that he was a member of MS-13. When President Trump declared MS-13 to be a foreign terrorist organization, that meant that he was no longer eligible under federal law, which I'm sure you know, you're very familiar with the INA, that he was no longer eligible for any foreign immigration relief in the United States. So he had a deportation order that was valid, which meant that under our law, he's not even allowed to be present in the United States and had to be returned because of the foreign terrorist designation. This issue was then, by a district court judge, completely inverted, and a district court judge tried to tell the administration that they had to kidnap a citizen of El Salvador and fly him back here. That issue was raised to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful, and its main components were reversed 9-0 unanimously, stating clearly that neither Secretary of State nor the President could be compelled by anybody to forcibly retrieve a citizen of El Salvador from El Salvador, who again is a member of MS-13, which, as I'm sure you understand, rapes little girls, murders women, murders children, is engaged in the most barbaric activities in the world, and I can promise you, if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
So you don't plan to ask for it?
So in other words, at least according to all these top officials, The big story that was going around for weeks was fake, yet again. Of course, you can decide which side you want to believe, the Trump cabinet and Bukele, or these news outlets. Because again, there's discrepancies between the claims. Now, in other news, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg is facing an antitrust trial. This is alongside congressional investigations into the company. And this could actually see Meta get broken up. It's also exposing something else, alleged CCP interference, including deals for censorship. Now, first off on the antitrust trial, this is BBC, it says this. A trial in the landmark antitrust case against social media giant Meta kicked off in Washington on Monday. It says lawyers for the U.S. Competition and Consumer Watchdog allege Meta unlawfully quashed rivals by purchasing Instagram and WhatsApp over a decade ago. Remember the context of this? Donald Trump has now signed an executive order against monopolies. Now, technically, this antitrust violation predates that, but one of the concerns with Meta, again, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, is they're taking over online chat and online social networks and effectively running them in ways that, at least until recently, have been censoring people. And here's what they say, quote, they decided that competition was too hard and it would be easier to buy out their rivals than to compete with them, said Federal Trade Commission FTC lawyer Daniel Matheson. It notes that Meta countered that, the lawsuit from the FTC, which reviewed and approved those acquisitions as misguided, suggesting the FTC approved it. The counterpoint from the Trump team as well, that was the old team, this is the new one. And they say this, quote, Meta acquired Instagram and WhatsApp to improve and grow them alongside Facebook, the company's attorney Mark Hansen argued. It notes that a win by the FTC could force CEO Mark Zuckerberg to break up the company. And that could include spinning off the photo sharing app Instagram and messaging service WhatsApp, meaning maybe 3 different companies instead of just one. Now, notice the FTC says the company overpaid when it acquired Instagram for $1 billion in 2012. 2 years later, it purchased the WhatsApp for $19 billion. A big difference in money. Now, notice that on Monday, Matheson referenced a 2012 memo from Zuckerberg in which he discussed the importance of, quote, neutralizing Instagram. And that is a pretty bad paper to have out there, the discussion of neutralizing a competitor. Now, Matheson called the message, quote, a smoking gun. And it notes that Meta, on the other hand, said the purchase has made the consumer experience better. Now, this comes at an interesting time for the company. Zuckerberg's having a change of face. He's taking a very different political stance. He had what some people call his glow up. He has a tan now and looks a little more like bulky. He's been working out. But he's taken a very different stance also on the political stage. Back in 2020, remember, Zuckerberg was accused of election programs, remember the Zuck Bucks, that have benefited Democrats a lot more than they did Republicans. Now, some critics suggested that could have violated election laws, but we never really saw any cases on that. Nothing ever happened. And then in 2024, Zuckerberg took a very different position, where he was seemed at least, heavy with the Democrats in 2020. During the 2024 election, he appeared to have warmed up to the new Trump presidency. Now, his companies are also starting to drop some of their censorship programs, and it seems that at the very least, he's standing on the sidelines saying, I'm not going to get involved in partisan politics, to an extent. At the same time, though, he and other big tech CEOs, they're also working with the Trump administration to fight back against like European censorship, especially when it comes to the rolling fines they're putting on American companies just about every year. Zuckerberg has been very outspoken on that. And also, Zuckerberg has alleged that many of those policies for censorship were implemented through government pressure, including in the United States. And he has also since started removing the fact checkers from Facebook under claims that the fact checkers likewise seem to censor according to their own bias. How do you monitor the monitors, right? But the whole censorship debate is far from over. A Facebook whistleblower recently exposed the alleged relations that Facebook had with the Chinese Communist Party. This is BBC. It says, A former Facebook executive has told the BBC how the social media giant worked hand in glove with the Chinese government on potential ways of allowing Beijing to censor and control content in China. Now, notes that Sarah Wynne Williams, a former global public policy director, says in return for gaining access to the Chinese market of hundreds of millions of users, Facebook's founder Mark Zuckerberg considered, suggesting maybe he didn't fully do it, but considered agreeing to hiding posts that were going viral until they could be checked by Chinese authorities. And notice that Ms. Williams, who makes the claims in a new book, has also filed a whistleblower complaint with U.S. market regulators, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, alleging Meta misled investors, which means it could be criminal. And notes the BBC has reviewed the complaint as well. And in her SEC complaint, Ms. Wynne Williams also alleges Mr. Zuckerberg and other Meta executives had made, quote, misleading statements in response to congressional inquiries about China. Now, one answer given by Mr. Zuckerberg to Congress in 2018 said Facebook was not in a position to know exactly how the Chinese government would seek to apply its laws and regulations on content. Meta told the BBC that Mr. Zuckerberg gave accurate testimony, adding it did not operate services in China. The caveat there would be if he had communications with them, which would have given them that information. And again, you could decide maybe in a court of law whether that would be giving false testimony or not. Well, look, we can get some answers on all these things pretty soon, though. Zuckerberg is now being called in to testify before Congress. And The Hill said this: Senator Josh Hawley called on Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg to testify before Congress after a former Facebook employee, the one we just discussed, alleged the company repeatedly undermined U.S. national security and said, quote, the American people deserve to know the truth about your company, Hawley wrote in a letter to Zuckerberg on Thursday and added, quote, the public deserves to hear your response to these serious allegations, particularly since they pertain to American national security. Now, notes that Hawley requested Zuckerberg testify before the Senate Judiciary Crime and Counterterrorism Subcommittee in an upcoming hearing titled A Time for Truth, Part 2, Oversight of Meta's Foreign Relations and Representations to the United States. Now, notes the letter came one day after the same subcommittee heard from Sarah Wynne Williams, the former director of global public policy at Facebook, who told lawmakers Meta executives repeatedly, quote, betrayed American values during her 7 years of the company. And notes as well that Wynne Williams accused Meta executives of working to, quote, win favor with leaders in Beijing to build an $18 billion business in China. And remember the viral video of Zuckerberg having Xi Jinping's book on his desk, right? They were courting them, also going for a jog in Beijing, enjoying that fresh Beijing air. But look, this is an ongoing investigation. We could get some answers soon, but the investigations of Meta, which includes Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, could also be the start of this whole debate. Google is also facing similar antitrust investigations. Right now, it's not just, again, Meta. There are other companies facing very similar investigations, and Google has also faced many of the same allegations. Allegations of ties to the Chinese Communist Party, including with censorship outside of China. So we'll very likely have a lot more information on all that pretty soon. Google may be in trouble because, look, quick question, how many of you still use Google for your searches? For those of you who still use it, do you believe it gives you accurate results free from any kind of political bias? Well, if you said no to either of those, you're not alone. Alphabet, which Google is under, is really not doing well right now. And there are reports suggesting it's trending in similar ways to Kodak before the company went down. MarketWatch said this. In addition, Alphabet now has a branding problem. Google is a verb, but its Gemini artificial intelligence offering is not. ChatGPT, however, has verb status with younger users, like Grok does as well. Who notes that Ben Tienses of Melius Research wrote, will say things like that they chat GPT'd their papers for school. And it notes that while OpenAI could see $12.7 billion in revenue from subscriptions this year, Reuters expressed doubts that Google could squeeze that much money out of Gemini subscriptions. Who's using Gemini, right? It says OpenAI does not show advertisements currently, but if it did, quote, advertisers would have to respect its youthful user base, according to Reuters. And he said, how could at least 20% of the world's search ad budget, about $40 billion, not go to OpenAI when they eventually figure this out? Meaning, Google has a monopoly. What happens when you lose that monopoly? Well, you can only go down. You can't go up. And they add this. From a stock perspective, he added that the Kodak example is a cautionary tale. Kodak stock saw its forward price to earnings multiples fall from 20 times to 7 times over 3 years. Kodak was once the Dow Jones Industrial Average, but now has a market capitalization of only about $500 million. And Google could be going the way of Kodak. Now look, that's also becoming a trend. A lot of people are now turning to tools like OpenAI. Some people use Grok as their replacement for online search. Instead of going on Google, they're going on, again, maybe X and typing in Grok what they want to know. Some say that it's less censored. Some say it gives better search results. Depends on what you're looking for, I guess. But all it could take is one of those companies creating an online portal or something to have ads similar to Google, which means they siphon out that money to do searches, and then boom, that could be the end of Google as we know it. Now, personally, I'd say Google has made itself irrelevant because of censorship. Now, people have pointed to the censored search results that only show what are deemed as reputable sources, but often just represent censorship along partisan lines. If you search for certain narratives, you're probably not going to find them on Google. You're going to find just the curated results of all the big corporate media and a whole lot of nothing else. And also, you know, a lot of the top results are just sponsored posts. And people have raised this issue as well. If you type in a search, you get a long list of sponsored things, some recommendations, and then after that, just a curated list of the big corporate media basically giving their take on things. Google used to be a lot more useful. You used to be able to type in and it would find what you're actually looking for. But now, I'd say because of censorship, and maybe a lot of greed possibly, people are turning to other tools that are not as censored. They're probably still censored, but not nearly as much. And what happens then? If one of those tools that people are now turning to anyway releases something that could easily replace what Google has to offer for the average person, well, that kind of change can make a company go belly up overnight. Now, that said, let me know if you still use Google, you think it's fantastic. If not, what do you use as a search engine? I'm curious. Leave a comment below this video. Also, don't forget to hit the like button, folks. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.